I think as we're talking about like Clay Evans as a model for urban ministry today, one of the things that really it's stunning to me, Lisa, is his courage. Like when I hear his stories about how he stood with Dr. King and how these city leaders were, and these were like gangsters back in the '60s. Like they were serious players, and the threats that they made against him and the threats that they made good on, how he felt humiliated that he couldn't finish this building project. He eventually got it done, but how for 7 years it just stood as this monument of what his courage cost him.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by another special guest, Dr. Zach Mills. Welcome, Dr. Mills.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
I'm excited to have you on. I saw your book. I stumbled across it just scrolling on Facebook one day. We had a mutual friend, and I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Then I added you as a Facebook friend, and I was like, man, I'm gonna get him on the podcast. And I finally reached out to you this weekend to try to get you on the podcast. So I'm so excited that you accepted the request and you were free this week. So it was short notice. So I'm excited for that. For those who don't know who you are, just give them a little bit of background about yourself.
Sure. My name is Zach Mills. I am a communication scholar and a preacher. And so my passion is communication, all things related to how we communicate. And, my big passion is how do we use words? How do we use communication to bridge divides, to close gaps, to bring us closer together? And so I teach preaching classes, I teach public speaking classes, and so pretty much I nerd out over anything related to communication. So that's my thing.
That's good. I probably need your assistance so I can stop saying so much.
Yep. I'll do that.
For those who haven't heard, what is the title of your book, and why did you think it was important to write it?
Yeah. So the title of the book is called The Last Blues Preacher: Reverend Clay Evans, Black Lives, and the Faith That Woke the Nation. Let's see. Why did I feel like I should write it? The short story is it was really like something I felt led to do. It really was a calling. And I know that kind of, to some that might sound weird or corny, but it really was like I did not start out in my mind thinking, hey, I'm going to just write Reverend Clay Evans' biography. I'm going to write a biography. That was the furthest thing from my mind. It just so happened that a church I was serving in Chicago in 2011, I was approached by two people after service one day, and they asked me if I'd heard of Reverend Evans, and I said, well, I've heard of him, but I don't know him personally. And they asked me if I'd be interested in writing his biography, and I was like, is this real? And so then we met, and there were so many similarities between me and Reverend Evans that I really kind of felt like this was a universe kind of thing, a God kind of thing, lining this up. And so that's really was just something I felt led to do after I met him and saw that it was scary, Lisa, how many things we had in common. And the blues, like the pain that Reverend Evans went through, that's really why that made the title, because that's something I really connected with. I had different struggles, different pains, but it was we could relate. It was so relatable. And oftentimes we see someone like Clay Evans, who's this larger than life figure, and we kind of see the end result. We don't see everything that it took to get there. So that's really, the similarities that we had. And then how relatable his story was, even though he had done things I had not done in my life. It was so relatable and so real. So I just felt led to write it.
That's awesome. So, for those who don't know who Clay Evans is, kind of just give
Yeah.
a little bit of background for our audience.
Yeah. Reverend Clay Evans is, he was this pastor and civil rights leader in Chicago. His church, Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church, he was the senior pastor of that church for 50 years. So let's see, 1950 to 2000, he led Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. Born in Brownsville, Tennessee. So I was literally just in Brownsville last night for a book signing, and he was born there, uh, the son of sharecroppers, and moves to Chicago in 1945 to escape racism and find a better life. And then made a name for himself as a gospel music singer, became this famous gospel music singer in Chicago. And then linked up with Dr. King in the 1960s and was like instrumental in Dr. King getting his foot in Chicago for the Chicago Freedom Movement. So Clay Evans is just this incredible gospel singer and a very courageous civil rights leader who made waves for a half a century in Chicago and is still making waves now. He's not really making many public appearances, but people call him, and rightly so, the godfather of Black preachers in Chicago. And so people are still being inspired by his legacy, even in 2018.
Mhm, mhm. I think that's amazing. As you were writing this book, what was some things that really stuck out to you about his life?
Wow. The trauma, that was first, the trauma that he had gone through. Um, Definitely in Brownsville, as he's working in sharecropping fields, as he's talking about that experience, saying, I asked him, how long would you guys work? He said, well, you didn't count it by hours, you count it by the sun.
Mm,
You start working when before the sun comes up, and you keep working usually when the sun goes down. And so just he described it as slavery. He said it was slavery times. And so just that pain, and then coming to Chicago, and then, you look at someone like Clay Evans who walked with Dr. King, but you never hear those stories about when he moves to Chicago and he's sleeping in a family friend's house at night and in a bad part of town, and rats are crawling across his feet at night.
mm,
You don't hear stories about when he was 3, he didn't speak words until he was almost 3. He was a sickly child. He was made fun of. He was bullied in school. Had very low self-esteem as a youngster. Those were the stories that really stuck out to me because you don't hear those. And as I began to hear more of those stories, I say, "Gosh, he's similar to me than I thought." This famous, incredibly courageous person who walked with giants and who's a giant himself is like, I struggle with that too, or that happened to me too. So the pain that I didn't think he had gone through, and then how relatable it was, that was one thing. And then there were so many things, Lisa. His humor. I didn't realize how funny he was. Someone who had gone through so much hardship, so many dark moments. The brother is absolutely hysterical. Like there were times when interviews when I would kind of get frustrated with him because he would have all of us cracking up, and I'm like trying to like engage in some serious line of questioning, and we're trying to get deeper into the story, and he's just cracking jokes. He was just hilarious. So that was really cool to see that someone who had gone through so many things, who had done so many amazing things, who was so respected by so many, but wasn't the kind of person who took himself too seriously. Took his calling seriously, took his work seriously, but he's so down to earth. That was another thing that stuck out to me because it made my job so much easier as like his biographer. He set me at ease. And yeah, so he was so funny. So those were two things that really stuck out.
that's awesome. And you talked about his time in the South
Yeah.
sharecropping and then him coming to Chicago. I mean,
Right.
going to Chicago, which seems like a more progressive space than the South. The you talk about a little bit of how racism in the South differed from racism in more progressive spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was one of the things that was very jarring for Clay Evans, because the kind of racism he knew in the South was like black folk are getting hung and shot and thrown into rivers, um, and being called the N word on sidewalks, that kind of. So it was so overt, so physical, so visceral, so in your face. And so he moves to Chicago thinking, trying to escape that. He does escape that kind of racial terror, but he realizes that Chicago is much like the South. That there's another kind of racial terror there, but it was more subtle. It was more artful and savvy. And so that was kind of one of the things that discouraged him early on. Was he was so excited and perhaps a little naive, as I think we all would have been in his shoes, just coming to this black metropolis, as many understood it, and a land of greater opportunity. And in so many ways it was, but yeah, there was the city structure, the political elite in Chicago was just such a force. And Clay Evans came to realize, as he began to go toe to toe with Mayor Daley, the older Mayor Daley, the Daley regime. He realized how the struggles of race were very much alive in Chicago. And Dr. King even says all the stuff he experienced in the South, he had never experienced the kind of racial hostility that he experienced in Chicago. So, yeah, I think it was in some ways more artful and savvy, and in some ways very much in your face in Chicago. So, yeah, that was a kind of a moment of disillusionment for Clay Evans, that he realized it was a city of promise, but not quite the perfect city of promise that many people had thought it was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really good and really helpful. I have some friends who went out to the Bay Area in the tech space,
Oh, yeah.
and you assuming as an African American going to that space that's so progressive,
Yep.
and them talking about the racism that they experience, how it kind of takes different forms. So as you were talking about, what Dr. Evans, Reverend Clay Evans experiences, it sounds like similar to some things we deal with today, thinking if I go to certain areas that are more progressive, then they're going to be kinder to me as a minority, but then you find different forms of racism.
No, it's true. It exists everywhere, and it is more savvy and subtle in some places, which initially kind of makes those spaces attractive to us, because our perception is that it's not quite as bad there.
Mhm.
And we often find that it is bad, and sometimes even more prevalent and worse. It's just figured out a way to camouflage itself. And as Clay Evans found, racism and internalized racism and self-hatred found its way into many black pastors in Chicago. So,
Mm.
so racism and prejudice and bigotry that were inflicted upon black folk over time, many of them kind of ingested some of that and internalized some of it, and then it began to project itself from black folk to other black folk in some instances. And so racism, yeah, I think that Clevens found that. I think we're finding that today, that it's so artful, and it is so savvy, and it does camouflage itself even in the form of progressive thinkers and Christian leaders. So yeah, it's an ongoing struggle.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit more about that self-hatred he found in that in this black church space?
Yeah, yeah, and the cool thing about Clay Evans is, i- at least what I observed of him, he didn't seem like he was the kind of person who really engaged in self hatred. I think that um, he did battle with self esteem issues, but the kinds of ways that we have seen how white folk and other kinds of people who have systematically oppressed other kinds of people, and those people have at times ingested, consume these kind of negative perceptions of themselves, and it turns into you know uh, the point when a person starts to believe the negative things that another culture has told them about themselves, and so self-hatred in that way. That I think that there were some people in Chicago that he encountered were that were engaged in this the sickness of self-hatred, and that sickness of self-hatred was being perpetuated and fueled in many ways, but in some ways by city leaders in Chicago, white city leaders who were giving certain Black religious leaders benefits and backroom deals for pushing the city agenda and kind of turning a blind eye to some of the injustices that were going on in Black communities. And so I think that notion of self-hatred is bound up into this issue of power and elitism in politics, and how it can be fueled if you feel like you're getting certain kinds of benefits that you weren't getting before, and people don't often think of self-hatred in that way, but I think that it can be related. So certainly Clay Evans and Dr. King experienced a lot of pushback from some Black pastors, and some of them weren't engaged in self-hatred, some of them were, but Chicago politics was really tricky and still is. And so I think that a lot of what was happening was this combination of self-hatred and then also just the seduction of power that was being offered from the higher ups and city leadership.
That's really good, because many people often don't think of self-hatred manifesting that way, but that's an excellent point. Can you speak to Reverend Clay Evans' work with Dr. King and how they became friends and how their work kind of helped in Chicago?
Yeah. So let's see. Jesse Jackson started attending Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church, Reverend Evans Church, about 1965. That's when those two were introduced. And Jesse was already really involved in the civil rights movement, and I think had worked with Dr. King on one or two previous initiatives. And so my understanding is that Jesse was the one who kind of made initial introductions. Who knows exactly when Clay and Dr. King met and how, but that's kind of my, to my knowledge, it seems that like Reverend Jackson introduced those two. But it was really 1966 when King moves to Chicago to launch the Chicago Freedom Movement, because he says, if we can get some kind of movement going on in the North, it will be undeniable proof that America has a racial problem. It's not just in the South. It's a problem that's manifesting everywhere in the country. But then Black pastors just started trying to do everything in their power. Many of them, not all, many tried to get Dr. King from coming, because a lot had kind of had their hand in the cookie jar, so to speak, in Chicago politics and these backroom deals. Certainly not all. But there was a lot of pushback from Black pastors, and Clay Evans was one who opened up the doors of Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church for Dr. King, one of the few, to have weekly meetings. And so that's where they had a lot of these meetings, was Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. And it just so happened that Clay Evans was building a new sanctuary at the time and was warned by city leaders, don't you mess around with Dr. King. If you do, there will be consequences. And the one consequence was the city shut down the building project on Clay Evans' new sanctuary. So his sanctuary stood there's famous pictures of it. Steel beams and concrete. This looks like a skeleton. Stood like that for 7 years because he chose to stand with Dr. King and support what Dr. King was doing. So that was really, I think, what solidified their friendship. And ministers like Father Michael Flager in Chicago told me that Coretta Scott King years later told him how much Dr. King admired and appreciated what Reverend Evans did by standing with him. So I think that was the kind of thing that really brought those two together, that struggle, both from city leaders and unexpectedly many Black pastors, where those two were just knit together by the craziness and chaos of that circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That's amazing. What things did they push in Chicago? What were the most pressing things that they saw at that time that they were um, initiatives they were trying to get going there?
Yeah. So I think Clay Evans really agreed with Dr. King that segregation in schools, so poor schools, segregated schools, and slum conditions. Those were the things that I think he and Reverend Jackson were trying to push when they founded Operation. Those are the issues that were really most pressing to them and to Dr. King. So I think, yeah, the segregation in schools, poverty, slum conditions. But then you get to the 1980s, and I think that for Clay Evans at that time, it was more the way that Black religious leaders were fractured in Chicago. So you have this I don't know where it comes from, but like this divide between South Side Black pastors and West Side Black pastors. Even today, there's this joke that that they tease each other, like so there was this divide between them. And in the 80s, Clay Evans was part of this initiative to bring them together, and they called themselves the Concerned Clergy for a Better Chicago, because they felt there were all these social issues and not enough coalitions of Black pastors coming together. So that was the most pressing issue. They came together and they started addressing um, issues one by one in the city. And so I think that that was a great model for how to like take stock of ways that divisions are present, but then to go beyond just naming the, oh yeah, we're all divided, to go beyond that, to actually take steps to say, okay, how do we get over this divide? How do we bring people together? And then once we're together, how do we systematically begin to start addressing the issues that are most pressing? So yeah.
I love that. Because me, one of my goals is to do. The sound is messing up in my
Oh yeah.
ear.
Okay.
Can you
I
hear
can
me?
hear you now. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Hmm.
One of my goals is to be a bridge builder. So I love when I hear um, people have those stories of bridge building.
Yeah. And I mean that's what I love about the work you're doing, Lisa, is that it's bringing people together, and it's not just bringing people together who agree, who share similar beliefs. And that's one of the like that's what I would say is one of the most pressing needs now, is that we live in this society where we're immediately burning bridges with one another because we share different beliefs. So we're so quick to do that, to tweet that tweet, to post that the Facebook post, to post that Instagram meme, to clap back at someone we disagree with. Um, and it's so I think that we're losing a skill. We're losing this ability to stay in relationships, genuine relationships, and to honestly listen to one another when we fundamentally disagree. And so I think that's I love that about the kind of work you're doing, and that's certainly what Clay Evans was um, trying to do. He's a bridge builder. And this was the thing I thought was so interesting about him, is he built so many bridges with folk that you would say, Clay, no, that person should be your enemy. You should think of that person your enemy. And he would treat them with respect. He would listen to them. He would come to the table and reason with them, and try to build bridges. And I think that's something not enough people are doing now. There's this obsession with blowing bridges up and the spectacle of it. People are trying to gain followers and followings by the spectacle of blowing stuff up and causing more division. So
Spot on with that, Dr. Mills. Can you speak to a little bit more the relationship between the Black church and the civil rights movement? Because I think there's oftentimes a little bit of a romanticized memory of its engagement. And can you just speak more to that?
yeah. Yeah, so I think we often talk about the civil rights movement in retrospect, and we say, oh yes, the church was behind the movement, and and the church, some churches were behind the movement. Many religious folk and people who believed in God were behind the movement, but certainly not all. And so I think that's certainly a romantic notion that we have, that all churches, all Black churches, were so invested in the movement. And the evidence of that is when I talk to people and I say, do you know when Dr. King came to Chicago, so many Black pastors were against him? And they're like, what? So that's the evidence that we are kind of living in this romanticized notion that when we think back to Dr. King right after, the Nobel Peace Prize, and surely everybody loved Dr. King wherever he went. Surely that, no, he was hated by a lot of people, and was hated by a lot of good meaning, faithful Black Christian folk. But again, part of that has to do with the complexity of Chicago politics, and how some, certainly not all, some Black pastors had already were already benefiting from being very closely aligned with the white political elite power structure, and so that made it. And some of these pastors had real needs because of the influx of, like, the Great Migration, all these Black Southerners that were coming north, and all of a sudden you had these Black churches and pastors that were trying to figure out how to provide for these people. So it wasn't all just nefarious. I'm going to align myself with Chicago political leaders because I'm trying to gain power. Part of it was necessity and practicality. They needed resources. So, and then certainly there were, I'm sure, some that were seduced by the power. So, but it was so complex. And so, but yeah, to your point, we certainly do live with a romanticized notion of Black churches. And we don't often emphasize the ways that some of those churches and how some of those pastors were actively working against people like Dr. King and people like Clay Evans. Those are stories that I find fascinating because they're not often told. And yeah.
Definitely, definitely. What else about your book do you want to share that we haven't already discussed that you think is vital for our audience to know?
Oh goodness. I think as we're talking about, like, Clay Evans as a model for urban ministry today, one of the things that really, it's stunning to me, Lisa, is his courage. Like, when I hear his stories about how he stood with Dr. King, and how these city leaders were, and these were like gangsters back in the 60s, like they were serious players, and the threats that they made against him, and the threats that they made good on, how he felt humiliated that he couldn't finish this building project. He eventually got it done, but how for 7 years it just stood as this monument of what his courage cost him, this unfinished monument. And he felt so bad about that. He said pastors would stand outside his church and laugh at him, wait for him to come out and say, hey, look what your foolhardy mission cost you. But his courage to like plant his feet and to stay the course. And I think today, progressive Christian leaders have mastered the rhetoric of social justice. Many of them are still struggling with fear of what living that rhetoric out will actually cost. And so that's the thing that I'm always thinking about now, and I'm guilty of this, because I'm trained in communication and rhetoric. So I know how to speak it, and I know how to speak it to make a congregation hucklebuck, to make folk holler. I know how to do that. But then there also is this part when I think of Clay Evans' story that, man, like when you actually are living this out, it can look really bad in terms of a consequence. Like it can cost so much. And I'm wondering, Lisa, in many of our communities, if the reason why some of the problems, certainly not all, I'm wondering if some of the problems are not being fixed because we have people who have learned so well how to articulate the rhetoric of social justice, but are not quite willing to cross that line, to open themselves up, to be vulnerable, fully vulnerable to the consequences of what it will actually mean, what it will actually cost. So I think fear is something that is preventing a lot of really courageous ministry work from happening.
The nail on the head with that, as I'm having an event called Courageous Conversation. I myself sometimes struggle with courage and knowing, what a particular stance or um, just bridge building period, what that costs. And so, it really, courage is really a big, big part of that.
Clay Evans certainly taught me about what does it mean to take risks, calculated risks, made after much prayer and thought and conversation and collaboration. But I do think that we're living in this culture of I mean, look at even social media, the way that all these filters that we have to prevent. I mean, all these filters. I mean, some of them are fun, and it's okay. That's fine. But like for me, the larger cultural phenomenon is that all these filters that we have, we're creating all these ways to not be vulnerable, to not be our full selves. And I'm wondering, how does that? Are there other kinds of implications? Our habits in social media, do they play out in how we lead? Is there a certain kind of a lack of vulnerability that plays out in our leadership ministries because of how we've learned how to engage the world and others through social media? So that's something I'm constantly thinking about, like that we are a generation that is risk aversive, like we're terrified of risk. And I think our social media habits are evidence of that. Like social media is a very convenient way to curate a very safe image, a safe perception of ourselves. So I don't know, but it's a struggle. We all struggle with that. It's not something that's, I think, easy for any of us. But it's Clay Evans. That's what is so inspiring to me, is he makes me think daily about, like, how do I walk that out? Like, how do I think about taking risks and being courageous, even when I'm unsure of what's ahead of this next step, you know? And so, yeah.
That's so good and so helpful. How can people get in contact with you, Dr. Mills, on social media, and how can they get your book?
So you can find me on social media, Zach W. Mills, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Zach W. Mills. So you can find me there. My website is zmills.com, just the letter Z, mills.com. If you want to enter a book giveaway to get a free copy of the book, you can text the word "the ship." So Clay Evans called his church the ship. Affectionately, it was known as the ship. This great image of a group of people moving forward somewhere better together. So you can text the ship, THESHIP, to 44222 to enter that giveaway. And you can find the book on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, The Last Blues Preacher.
I greatly appreciate it, Dr. Mills. This has been a rich conversation, and I know that our audience will enjoy all the helpful things you share on today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me. And keep running on, sister. You're doing amazing work. And I love this notion of courageous conversations, because I think the world's not having enough of them, especially with people who disagree with them. So keep going, keep running.